What sort of psychosis was that, and how was that ever even on the table?
There are some that are very, very clearly served by having access to transition.
Trans rights equals the right to sterilize children. It's just that abhorrent.
This is a parental rights issue. I think you're going to be saving them a lot of trauma.
I actually don't believe in transgender children per se.
I was a trans child in the sense that there's nothing that ever would have dissuaded me from this path.
What trans is right now needs to be destroyed. Things were better for trans people when nobody knew what the f we were.
All right, Blaire and Brianna, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Excited to be here, Brad. Thanks for having us.
So Blaire, I'll come to you first. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about how you feel about this issue more broadly? Why do you think this stuff needs to be banned for kids ASAP?
Well, of course, you can point to, all the studies that have been done in the past few years as far as puberty blockers and their impact on development. And you can look at the explosion of detransitioners, regret rates. You can look at all of that stuff. And there's actually a part of me that feels like we're kind of past that. And what we need to sort of do is remind ourselves of just like very basic common sense. And I think that sometimes that feels like an easy way out, or people want to intellectualize things a little too much. But to me, the entire concept of children transitioning is just something that I think in retrospect, I was never on board, but I think society in general in retrospect is kind of going to be like, what sort of psychosis was that? And how was that ever even on the table? Why did we need to wait and find out exactly, the negative impacts of these drugs to understand that, chemical castration and sometimes physical castration of minors is something that should be okay. It's not a standard we hold for so many other things that are so much less consequential. You can go down the whole cliche list of like, you can't even get in a tanning bed if you're under 18 in California, or you can make comparisons to other permanent things like tattoos. And actually that's not even good enough because tattoos are less permanent than surgery. So, for me, I think that we're just in a different era now post second Trump term. And I think what the trans community needs to do, I know everyone thinks that I never have sort of like the best interest for the community in mind, but if there is any hope of a recalibration to happen, of, any sort of making up any ground we lost in terms of public respect, I think it has to just be reducing it back down to the bare bones of like transition is something for adults, and all these sort of excesses of the trans movement, not just this one, they kind of all need to be recalibrated. They all need to be, reimagined, I guess. I think that there needs to be a reckoning in the community that the way that, the community's been doing things and the activists we let speak on our behalf have actually taken things straight to hell. And, that's a song I've been singing for years. And I'm not here to like hold any sort of gripe against, anybody who didn't see it till now, because I'm thankful they did. I just wish it was sooner. And I swear to God, I'm not making any digs at Brianna. I'm talking about the community in general, because I have a lot of people now saying that, how did it go this far? And I think it's because, we let a lot of people who aren't even trans speak for us.
Yeah.
And it sort of allowed people who are trans to become extremists. And it's really bad. I know I'm going a bit off topic, but I imagine this is going to be sort of a more broad conversation anyways. Just leave the kids alone. Any movement that allows itself to even optically be seen as a threat to women and or children is destined to fail, is going to die, and kind of deserves to. So I think we need actually I don't know if we need it actually, but if there's going to be a replacement of the old ways of the trans community, there needs to be a whole new movement based on different values.
Yeah. So Brianna, I'll come to you on this, but I think you definitely have some degree of agreement with the trans activism going off the kind of reservation, but you ultimately don't think that this stuff should be totally carte blanche prohibited legally. Talk us through why you feel that way.
So I want to go to that, but I really want to hit this first. Blaire, you said something like there were a lot of people in the trans movement that did not see this before now. Can I just ask you flat out, you really, with everything you do and say, your top goal is protecting the trans community, right? Like that's what you're thinking about when it comes to this issue. Am I correct to understand that's where you're coming from?
I don't think I have one top goal. I
Mm-hmm.
think that, part of transitioning, and you know this because you transitioned many years ago. I'm
Yeah.
10 years in myself. The integration into just regular society for me
Thank you.
happened a long time ago. And so
Yes.
when it comes to top goals, I wouldn't necessarily put the trans community at the very top, but it's among the things that I deeply care about because
Sure.
I don't enjoy the backlash the community's
No.
gotten.
No.
It's not as if I'm untouched by it at all.
Sure.
But I,
And
I also care
well,
about women and children as well. So I have a
yeah.
lot of priorities, I guess.
I think that's fair. I think what I was going to say is like, I'm 4 months into kind of finally publicly saying, you know what, Blaire White and everyone that was warning there was going to be a backlash if we stayed on this course. I agreed with you for years and years and years. When you did that Jubilee video calling out the non-binary side, I 100% agreed with you. I did not have the courage in that moment to have your back. And if more liberal Democrats like myself had, we would not have this executive order today. So I think I just want to really say it is on us for not having common sense about this. Now,
I
Brad,
appreciate that, by the
I
way.
genuinely
Thank
mean
you.
it. You've been out here tanking for the team for what, 10 years? I've been doing this for 4 months. I'm losing my mind. It's awful. It is so exhausting. You're trying to save trans people. They're all screaming at you all the time. It's like, I wouldn't be out here doing this if I wasn't trying to make sure we have a path to healthcare. Brad, to your question, like, how do I feel about children transitioning? So I entered into this, like the Brianna Wu of 5 years ago, assumed that when WPATH was saying this stuff was safe, that WPATH was an actual scientific organization. It's not. And I'm sure Blaire and I both looked at these stories about the activist fringe hijacking of the science there. And I think there's a ton of concerns that have to be addressed here. So what I've done is, in good faith, I've gone through every single one of these subgroups as best as I can. I've asked scientists for answers. I've made friends with journalists. I've really made the best faith effort I can to understand this. And I think you have three groups. I think one is the non-binary political project, where I think Blaire and I are both going to agree they do not need to be transitioning. If you don't feel very strongly you're a man or a woman, you do not need to be medically transitioning. It's medical malpractice for them to do that. So take them off the table. The second group is the female to male transsexuals. They were not a force when I transitioned 20 years ago. There were a few of them here and there, but like it was Buck Angel, and that was it. This is the largest part of the cohort. It has expanded wildly. They don't transition for the same reasons that we do, and there's no rush whatsoever to getting them medically transitioned. So I say take them off the table too. Testosterone will work just as well for them at 19 as it will at 14. They're the ones with all the desistant traits. Just make them wait. We're not the same thing. The third group is people like us, Blaire, male to female transsexuals. And I think we would both agree that WPATH has compromised the standards here. And there are far too many male to female transsexuals that are going through this and are being medicalized where it's not a good fit for them. But there are some that would fit that old school 6 out of 6 category that are very, very clearly served by having access to transition. And what makes sense to me is taking a pause, admitting that GLAAD, WPATH, the ACLU, all these organizations have hijacked the science, and that we need to start over and build some standards and leave a window open there to identify those children with new clinical protocols. I think that makes sense to me. But what I'm talking about would shrink the number of children transitioning by easily 90%. So I think like it doesn't have to be an all or nothing policy solution.
For those people though, Brianna, why can't they wait till 18?
Because testosterone is a one-way street. It will screw your body up in a way that will make it much more difficult for you to integrate into society. It's just testosterone is so powerful. Let me give you a really specific example. I've had 3 separate surgeries on my jaw to make it like small enough that I look decent. I have partial paralysis on one side of my face. These surgeries are not innocuous. So I just think that, I think that if we can identify those few kids, I think you're going to be saving them a lot of trauma down the line.
So Blaire, why don't you buy that argument, right? Because if you have kids who are genuinely trans, who are going to be trans women when they grow up. If they do this when they're younger, they'll be able to more effectively transition. That's not compelling enough to allow it for you, right?
No, I find that most of the arguments, well, really all of the arguments about allowing, if we just want to narrow it down to male to female
Mm-hmm.
transition underage, it's hard for me to ever hear one that isn't based on aesthetics. And I know that aesthetics can sort of have like a deeper meaning in the trans community because it means also social integration, and there's something to be said for that. However, I just think that aesthetics is never a trade-off for being able to have children someday, and then you look at just the fact that even, trans adults who, even if they start as adults, there's such a wide variety of things that you can choose to do or not to do, right? So for me, I started at 20 and I still wish I would have had more information about, what it meant for having children in the future. And that's something that's now off the table for me simply because I wasn't informed. And then it goes to, well, obviously there needs to be more information. But I find that, I mean, if we were to do it sort of how you just laid out, Brianna, it's still, I'm finding difficulty locating where we can switch the people that are currently doing all the protocols and seeing all the patients, because these are the people that have been stolen by the activism. And so we would have to literally replace almost everybody. I mean, you know this as well as I do, even the amount of just like credible doctors and surgeons that like adults see in this space is so limited, and there's so many issues, and the few that are like okay have this weird monopoly, and then it's just strange. I guess I just don't trust anybody who's been in charge of this to even adhere to different rules, because they had actually been breaking many of the rules for a long time, even though this is where the leftists do get one thing correct, is that there have been guidelines for, minors transitioning that have been, especially in the not so distant past, a little bit stricter, but you had these professionals who were completely bypassing them. You've had whistleblowers coming out and stating that at clinics, there were children coming in and switching their pronouns day to day and still getting put on hormones. So I just don't trust the people in charge to do this. I also think that, there is just no trade-off for, I respect the fact that you chose to do surgeries to your face, and I did as well. I guess it's just like I would trade that for a second, any facial work I had, for like the ability to have children.
Yeah.
And so if you start that at a young age, that's just gone. The chance is zero. Whereas, it's also subjective if you necessarily needed those surgeries, and it's going to be subjective for each person. At its core, trans is, if we just want to be real, it's a mind issue, but it's very much a body issue.
100%.
And there's a reason why people do conflate it with things like body dysmorphia, because they are kind of like sister disorders here. And so, it's subjective if you even needed those surgeries, and if I ever needed my surgeries. So I think it really just comes down to 18. And I know that that's going to be, harder for some people if they have to wait, if they genetically are going to be too tall or whatever, but even too tall is subjective. So I think that what's objective are the things that are, irrevocably changed through transition that minors can't reverse afterwards. You also have to remember that, there's a difference between, like you said, Brad, what about the children who know that they're trans and are going to end up being trans? There may be some, you know what I mean? And I don't deny that, because I've met people like that who are like, they knew at 14 and they're 35 years old and they're still like, I would never change a thing. I'm glad. However, that doesn't mean they knew the reality of being trans in general. So they didn't know what it actually would mean to walk through the world, being trans. And that's a huge factor for if you should transition or not. If you're weighing like, should I do this or should I not? You really need to have somewhat of an adult scope of what your life would actually be like. And on the flip side to all of this, I've also met, trans people who transitioned underage, and not to be too harsh, but do not meet any criteria that people would call passable. It's all a range. There's people that transition as kids and they still shoot up to 6 feet tall, and they still don't look a certain way people might perceive a woman to look. So I think that 18 is not too big of an ask. There's so many things in society we're restricted to doing until 18. And there's always people that argue back and forth on that. But for me, I think it's a good compromise and would actually show good faith to the general public if the community just was, you know what, if it's 18, that's probably for the best. Because I think that it is ultimately. I'm never the kind of person who's going to limit anybody who is of an adult age to do anything, frankly. And so the people maybe on the right or the more of a turf ideology who, make the arguments about, well, actually, the frontal lobe is at 20 something. And if at 18 you can live, if at 18 you can live and die for your country, you can get a surgery or you start a drug that you wanted to start. So I'm an 18 person.
Yeah. So Brianna, on these points, right?
Boy, I've got a lot of them.
Yeah. How about I just open it up to you? What do you think about some of the points Blaire just raised?
Blaire, so you said a lot there. I'm going to try to just respond to it respectfully as we're going through there. So first of all, you made this broad claim that you've never heard, like the only reason to transition when you're like younger is aesthetic. I let me tell you a story I've seen. It is a friend of mine, a very, 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 very close family member that has transitioned. This is someone who is, she was autistic, and when she was very, very young, started like throwing the spaghetti across the room and saying, "I'm a girl," right? Was just broken down, really miserable. She got help. She transitioned through one of these clinics. And for me personally, like, just watching her go and integrate into dance class and having these normal experiences with girls her age.
That was as a minor?
Yes, as a minor. What's really remarkable to me is when I talk to her, she's just a normal teenage girl. Like, she sidestepped all of this trauma that set my life wildly off course. So look, I am 47. Obviously, there's a lot more to being a woman than being hot. This is a lesson most people learn in their 30s. You've got to have other stuff to evaluate yourself from. So truly, like, when I'm talking about this, it is saying I want people to be able to have these experiences and to sidestep this trauma and this guilt and this self-loathing that I think you can just interact with the community, and it's everywhere. Also here, though, I really want to be clear and acknowledge something you said, Brad, which was, how do we know which of these kids that say they're girls at a young age are going to grow up? The mathematical truth is 9 out of 10 of what you would call HSTS trans people is going to grow out of it. I interviewed John Michael Bailey the other day.
Can you explain what that means, though?
Sure.
HSTS?
Oh boy, we can get into the typology. Homosexual transsexuals, basically identifying at a young age. His book, he starts off with like kind of the classical transsexual case, like heels, wearing Barbie dresses, makeup, all that stuff. And at the end of the book, he grows out of it, which was shocking to me reading it. So it's really critical that if we do have this pathway, that you not do anything permanent until you're somewhat through puberty, because a lot of these kids are going to grow up and be gay. To the kids' point that you brought up, Blaire, I really feel you on this. I'm in my 40s. It is increasingly tough to have so many of my cis girlfriends. They've got kids and I don't. My friend group is people in their 20s and 30s, which is weird. So I hear you on that, but I also know, like, I knew I liked men as soon as puberty hit. Like, there is no like future I ever had where I was going to date and marry a woman and have children. Like, that just is not the case for a lot of the kids that are going to have like onset gender dysphoria. And, I myself was adopted. I think there are other pathways to being a parent there. As far as, waiting to be 18, I would remind you that Trump's executive order makes you wait until 19. From other things he said, it also stops children from getting social support at school if they're socially transitioning and trying again to sidestep that guilt. I think you and I probably agree that gender ideology needs to be out of school. But if a parent is making a healthcare decision for their child and wants to socially transition them, I think that's a parental rights issue. So I feel like I was kind of scattershot in just grabbing all these things
Blaire,
you went off.
Let's get into some of the specifics of the order there. I mean, do you think it's a problem that it limits it till 19 in the executive order?
I would have preferred 18, but in a world where there's, children being transitioned, where you have women's sports being destroyed, where you have all the things we complain about, the excesses of the movement, I'm not going to be splitting hairs and be like, I need to fight for it to be lowered a year. You know what I mean? It's like, would I prefer 18? Yeah. Would I prefer it to be 19 if it means that 13-year-olds aren't getting double mastectomies? Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
Hell yeah. So like,
this isn't NPR. It's okay. It's YouTube.
Yeah.
Go for it.
There's something to be said about picking your battles, and I'm not going to make the difference between 19 and 18 my battle. Someone else can do that, but there's just bigger things here. As far as Brianna, what you mentioned about other pathways to have children, you mentioned adoption.
Yeah.
And I think adoption is a beautiful thing. I just think that you should not be in a position where you have to, or you're expected to choose that when you are a child yourself. I just think it doesn't make sense. And so I think that that's a decision, whether it's adoption or, for me, when I said that I wish I would have had more information about the sterilizing effects of the hormones, I meant that I wish I would have literally saved my DNA and possibly used it somewhere else. So, because I'm not into women either. I'm in a relationship with a man, so it would have been something just using my DNA. I think that the story you mentioned about the teenage trans person that I just would push back and say it's nothing about that person, obviously. So if they're watching, it's no disrespect, but
sure.
This is, if I understand, still a minor that you're discussing in the present.
Yeah.
So there's really no way of knowing if, in adulthood, this is going to be something, especially when it comes to autistic people, our brains actually, if you look it up, because I have a touch of the autism as well. And that's a very common trans thing. But
do you? I didn't know
our
that
brains
about
develop. You. Our brains develop at a bit of a slower rate, not in a way that makes us less intelligent, but the parts of the brain that are having to do with executive function, long-term reasoning, long-term decisions. Those things actually develop later than the average person, than an allistic person, and so. I'm not saying, like I said, that I want it, in your 20s until you're fully developed, but I'm saying that I just think it's too dangerous to leave it to kids, especially when it's mostly autistic kids transitioning and their brains develop even slower than allistic children. I can't remember if there's anything else I wanted to address in that. I'll throw
I
back
do
to
want
Brad,
to agree with you strongly. Like this explosion of autistic people in the community. Like I think, like every part of this is really understudied. And Blaire, you're only 10 years in. I'm 20 years in. Like this just was not a thing 20 years ago at all.
It wasn't even a thing when I started 10 years ago. Respectfully,
it's really surprising. I'm not sitting here saying that like someone with autism shouldn't transition. I can't make that call. I'm just saying it's different. And this is, I think, the criticism that you and I share, which is that, the progressive fringe will say the science is settled, the science is settled, the science is settled. It's not settled. The cohorts today are wildly different. And Blaire, I, a while back, was really curious. Like, why on earth did the DSM-5 change all these definitions? From when I transitioned to today, it's just pick your own gender. You can create your own gender in here. Was there a study showing that non-binary people benefit from medicalization? What was that methodology? I really dug into it. And it turns out that they just wanted a memo to make it easier for therapists to write whatever diagnosis they want. So they lowered it to 2 out of 6 criteria and changed it from want to be the other gender to or a gender that you create, which is just the shittiest science in the entire world. That's completely unjustifiable. So I'm fully in agreement with you that this whole thing has been politicized and we deserve better science. Someone considering medical transition deserves better science. I think where I differ from you is I'm coming to you with a solution easily 80 to 90% reduction. And I just think like the politics here are driving the decision. Because the Cash report did show that we can't strongly say that transitioning children helps them, but it also showed that we can't strongly show that transitioning hurts them, which to me indicates we need more science on this. And this is the frustrating part of the Trump executive orders, is it's prohibiting fuller research on this, which is not very constructive.
Yeah, I mean, so there will be more research to come out of other countries that will continue to allow clinical trials. But what do you make of that specifically, Blaire?
I just think that this is a topic that from, as long as I've been involved in this topic and speaking on it and researching it, the data is always just years and years behind what's actually happening. So, I was in 2017 making videos about what I saw was this like exponential boom in detransitioners, particularly kids. You're not seeing studies on that now. You're barely seeing studies on that now. And it's clearly so far behind the actual number of kids that are, desisting. It's actually insane. And so I think that, I just can't, I don't trust anybody even doing research on this topic. Everybody's taken by the ideology. What I think needs to happen is, it's not exactly what anybody wants to hear who maybe their first priority in life is trans liberation or trans rights or whatever. But I think trans people need to kind of go dark for a while. And what I mean by that is no one needs to go into hiding or live like a hermit. People still need to be contributing members of society. And in fact, that looks better on us when we are, and we show that we can be more than trans. However, the politicization of trans, it's easy to look at, well, now that we have a Trump administration, because these are the emails I'm getting, are people saying, well, now it's all messed up because the Trump administration is doing this and right wingers are politicizing it. Make no mistake. It's not to play back and forth here. It's just to tell the truth. The politicization of the trans topic came from the left. It's been overwhelmingly at the hands of the left, and the right has started fighting back like in the last 2-3 years. So what I remember very clearly is being, in 2016, all of a sudden I'm seeing these bathroom bills, these transgender bathroom bills. And I'm looking at a world where I didn't know there was any issues with trans people in bathrooms. I'm a trans person very early in my transition. I have many trans friends, and everybody seems to know how to use the bathroom respectfully, and nobody seems to have an issue with anything. And so I'm like, wow, this is becoming a political football, and bathrooms and public accommodation, like that's been something society and transsexuals have figured out for a long time. So what's going on? Then I'm seeing, the one or two, instances of trans, kids or teenagers in small European countries become every state in the country. You can go get a double mastectomy for a 13-year-old. And people say, no, that's not happening. My own surgeon who's in Texas, a deep red state, he had to stop operating on 12-year-olds for double mastectomies when there was a new law enacted a few years back. And I didn't know he was operating on 12-year-olds. I would have took my business elsewhere when that happened for me. But, it just goes to show it got out of control so quickly. And so I think the best thing for trans people, if trans people want to figure out a way forward, is to really just, whatever is going to come in this Trump administration, I think, again, no one wants to hear it. The trans world needs to be a little bit humble and be like, honestly, we kind of deserve whatever happens, not violence, not any, not any constitutional, violations, nothing that is actually dehumanizing, but maybe a recalibration of what we consider to be a violation of trans rights. Because I'm seeing, activists right now screaming about trans rights are human rights, trans rights are human rights. And they think by copying and paste it 7 times in a tweet that means something. But what they mean by that is trans rights equals the right to sterilize children. Trans rights equals the right to destroy women's sports. Trans rights equals the right to walk into a woman's bathroom or changing room with a beard and a 7-inch penis. This is not anything to do with human rights. This is not social integration. This is social domination. And so until the community can let go of that, I don't think anybody's going to have any respect for anything that they ask for. And, it sucks because I don't want to see anything further happening. We can get into the areas of the new changes in the Trump admin about like passports and stuff like that. And those are examples that we can probably maybe find some more agreement on, Brianna. But as far as, kids and transitioning, I think this is just a battle the trans community needs to admit that they lost. They've been wrong about it every step of the way. Nobody's going to trust the community, even the brightest among us, for which there's not a lot of great public trans people. So the brightest among us is not actually like, I don't consider myself to be the brightest among us. I think but anyways, I think
you were right really early on when no one else was. So I think
right, but I'm also not that academic face that I feel like the community does actually need. Right?
Do you think we need an academic? I think that's the problem.
I don't know. Yeah. But the point is, I think that we kind of just need to take whatever comes and understand that it's a bit deserved in this next administration to a certain extent, obviously.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, go ahead, Brett.
A couple points about the executive order specifically that I want to talk to you specifically about, Blaire, because I think we might have a disagreement here. One of the things the order does is it calls for the creation of a private right of action, basically the ability to sue doctors that provided gender care for minors, and not sue them for malpractice, which you can currently do if they didn't follow the rules, or like you're talking about, the kids who are changing their pronouns every day and still getting HRT, that obviously went against guidelines. And so those people can be sued for malpractice. But there's something disturbing to me about the idea of being able to go back and retroactively sue doctors and potentially ruin them, or make their malpractice insurance skyrocket over something they did that, when they did it, they earnestly thought it was in the best interest of the patient. Now, they may have been wrong. I think it would be the position that I would hold and you would hold. And it also was what the authorities were telling them to do. The American Academy of Pediatrics, the Endocrine Society, all these major medical institutions, now they had been ideologically captured, we now know. But what doctors do is they look to these organizations for, okay, well, what's the standard treatment? And what Republicans are proposing in this executive order, it would have to be passed by Congress, is that you could sue doctors for doing what was legal and the proper in terms of what the authorities said to do at the time. That to me seems pretty unfair and kind of potentially pretty harmful to a lot of doctors who are doing their best. But I know you're much more, Blaire, skeptical of the medical field than I am.
I am. And that's almost like a virtue of getting older too. I'm almost at a point in my life where I'm like, I don't know. The doctor said not to get sunlight during COVID. So like, what's really a doctor? What's the good of doctors? But I do actually agree with you. You were wrong. We're not going to have much disagreement on this era, that if it was legal at the time, I don't think you can retroactively go back, or you shouldn't be able to retroactively go back and do that. And so I actually expect that won't be something that's actually passed, because I think that's just messy and that's not going to work out. And if it does work out, I'm going to disagree with it. I just am. But I think that, as far as going forward, if these trans sanctuary states still feel like they have the right to castrate underage people or provide this treatment, and they think that they just are providing that safe space, I guess, that safe haven for it, then they do need to be prosecuted. And so I would agree with that.
Well, and what about the trans activists trying to send them hormones illegally via social media?
God! You know how I feel, Brad.
I do know how you feel about that. Yeah, Brianna, are there any other parts of the executive order that give you pause beyond just the policies we've touched on so far?
Well, I hope we can come back and I can respond to some of the stuff that Blaire said. But I think that the biggest thing is, Blaire, I would love to know this. Like, do you not, and this is just getting real with you, like, I'm in my 40s. Do you not still have the lingering effects of growing up and feeling so much shame about who you are, who you were as a child? Like, I'm still, I understand how it led to maladaptive behaviors that I have to pause and think through. And I think what feels like the one instructing teachers that they can't call children that are socially transitioning by a name they want. Like, I think this is a parental rights issue. Like, let's say we compromise on what you're saying and we say medical transition, we want to wait until you're 18 to do that. But I think like socially transitioning, that I understand it's not innocuous, but I don't think like for a classical transsexual, that doesn't seem particularly problematic to me. If you're telling a parent they don't have the right to decide their own child's health care or what parts of their identity they're going to affirm, and you've got the government overriding that, for me as a liberal, but for you as a conservative, that seems way over the line. And I'm curious, are you with me on that?
Well, as far as, children or parents not being able to decide certain, make certain medical decisions for their children, there's
not
plenty
medical,
of areas.
Social. Names,
Okay.
pronouns, what your child's
Okay. Yeah. I mean, as far as names,
yeah.
I mean, you can, kind of use another phrase and call it a nickname. I think that there is an expectation that like names are okay. But I think that unfortunately what you have, and I know that you know this because I've seen you kind of make this statement too. And I think you feel where I'm coming from as far as like elections do have consequences. Social backlash has consequences. And unfortunately, the public school system has used and abused the trust of parents while we're on the topic of parents' rights. You have school systems, public schools that are quite literally, and this literally sounds like some satanic panic from the like 80s, 90s, thing to say, but it became the objective truth. You have schools trying to make children gay, trying to make children trans. This is something that objectively started happening when you're teaching queer theory, when you're making children choose their pronouns. This is, I just think I don't have it in me to even care that much about, if a school can't call someone named Tim, Ashley or something. Like there's just so much more consequential stuff happening in the trans world.
Really?
I think, I mean, yeah, I also don't necessarily know how I feel about, social transition for minors. I think that until a child is, able to make decisions for themselves, able to live on their own, I think that it's every parent's duty to raise their children to try to be the best version of the gender that they were born as. It's a parent's duty to raise a young boy to be a good man and a young girl to be a good woman. And I think that there's enough people who are showing, up all over social media in the news that are detransitioning that wish that would have happened for them. There's enough gay people who proclaim how they're so thankful that their parents did that for them and didn't transition them, that I don't really know how I feel about social transition. As far as, if I still feel any effects from, I think you phrase it as like shame from being a child. I think that's a universal experience for all people. I think all people, have a sort of nostalgic way of looking at their childhoods, but most of us, had to survive some traumas in our childhood. When we're young, we're vulnerable humans. We're weak. We're, naive to the world. And if you make it to adulthood without enduring some sort of trauma, you're like a 1%. You're a 1%er. And I think that for me, I actually would never take back any sort of pain I felt, of the sort of misalignment that we often describe with gender dysphoria as a child. I wouldn't take back any of the bullying I incurred, and people can take that as me saying that I support bullying, and that's not the case, because if I ever have kids and I find out you're bullying my kids, it's going to be a wrap for you. But I also, I find that, the shame, as you put it, or the struggles that I went through as a child, whether it's to do with trans or anything else, it shaped me into who I am. And I think that it also gave me a more level-headed view of what it is to be trans, to be honest.
Yeah.
If I would have grown up in this world where, at 12, my name was already Blaire and I was, making decisions like that and I was living that way, I don't think I would have as level-headed of a view of what it means to be trans. And, I think that every child, even transgender children, even if, I'll put it this way, because I actually don't believe in transgender children per se. I believe in children who have gender dysphoria. No, yeah, I believe in children who have gender dysphoria, and that can sometimes dissipate. That can sometimes mean that they're gay, because gay people sometimes, have gender dysphoria. That can sometimes be the result of certain traumas. It's not always transgender. I think that transgender is a status that you take on when you actually transition. And the way I view it should be as an adult, because that's an adult decision. But for children with gender dysphoria, I think that, every one of those children deserve the right to find out if that's something that dissipates for them, if that's something that was the result of trauma, or if that's something that they are just mistaking for being gay, or if it's something that because they're autistic, they simply aren't processing the binary of male and female properly, because that's a big thing. Autistic people, I'm only a little bit autistic. I'm like literally, I'm like right above the, like, you can get diagnosed, but you're not having much like issues with it.
I
right?
just want to hone in on 2 points there for Brianna.
Sorry.
Are trans kids a real concept, and should they be allowed to social transition?
So I think it's complicated, because I think, Blaire, what you said about children growing out of it's very true. You read Abigail Schreier's book, right? Irreversible Damage. Terrifying. terrifying. And I think that a lot of these girls, I 100% believe if rapid onset gender dysphoria research is allowed to continue, I think we're going to find this is a real thing with the female to male cohorts. So I think it's complicated. Like, I'm very, very sure that I was a trans child in the sense that there's nothing that ever would have dissuaded me from this path. I'm really sure of that. I think as a public policy, I think it makes sense to take a very, very steady hand. But Blaire, one of the things we do know, and I know you're less trustful of the science than I am, but there do seem to be extremely strong indications that if you're a male to female transsexual and you have that gender dysphoria before puberty, and you also have it like during puberty, like good way through it, there's an extremely strong chance you've got it for life. And I think, like, no matter what, those kids deserve support. Like, you deserve someone to go talk to that will help you figure out those feelings. I also just want to respectfully fact check something that you said. You're talking like there's a ton of surgery on children, and I fully agree with you for these FTMs, the mastectomies, particularly, completely out of control. No rush on that, which is why I was so glad to see the Plastic Surgeons Society just announced that they no longer support any kind of permanent medical surgery for someone under 18, which is exactly the right policy. That is 100% right. No surgeries, no vaginoplasty, none of that. So I just respectfully, I think, like, as I'm sitting here listening to you, I think you have a little bit of all or nothing thinking on this. Like, I understand that the trust has been broken, and I agree with you that the science has been hijacked by the progressive fringe, but I don't conclude that that means all science is bad and we need a maximalist ban. To me, it makes it that much more important to say build a new version of WPATH that's actually interested in finding the truth, that's not politically hijacked, that will actually figure out what the good standards of care are that we need. That's got to be done for adults anyway. So I think, like, you and I think I'm looking around for leaders and asking where they are, and they're not the people in the ACLU or GLAAD or HRC or any of these fringe organizations that have been hijacked. I think, respectfully, Blaire, it's people like you and me. You said something at the beginning of this, which is trans women we've been run out of our own movement, which is 100% true. This non-binary fringe has come into it, and to use Free Palestine's phrase, they've colonized us. And this avalanche of MTFs that showed up 5 minutes ago, they pushed us out of our own movement. It says so much that people like you and I that are trans medicalists, we don't have an organization acting for our civil rights anymore. So
can you explain what that means, trans medicalists?
Trans medicalists, so there are 2 points of view. Blaire and I agree that we have a mental health care issue, and it is ultimately a health care issue. I went to a doctor, I did therapy, I took some hormones to change my body, I got some surgery, then I got 2 more letters, and I got vaginoplasty. Very happy with every single part of that. They want to write sex out of law and say you can self-ID into a women's bathroom or women's sports or change it any day that you want to, and that being a woman is just a feeling. That is bullshit. And it has come at the expense of Blaire and I being able to live our lives and go to the fucking bathroom. It's really, really upsetting, Brad.
Yeah, so I guess I will ask you guys then, because part of what the Trump order deals with is insurance coverage. Blaire, to you, should this stuff for adults be covered by insurance as part of this medical perspective, or should it not be? And if it should be, does that include people who are on government insurance or in prison, for example?
Well, definitely not in prison. I think that if it comes down to private employers who want to cover whatever they want to cover, then that's an A+. Go ahead, do your thing. And that's, I think, the way to go. When it comes to taxpayers paying for this stuff, I think it's hard to look at, first of all, the trans medical community, and I don't mean trans medicalist, like people who believe it's a medical issue. I mean, like, the surgeons, I mean, like, the medical infrastructure around the trans surgery industry and care industry and the trans community itself and their activists. It's hard to look at this group of people and see that they haven't really used and abused people's, good faith support of them. There was a time where the T and the LGBT really enjoyed that, blanket support that society had in the early 2010s, especially, coming off the heels of gay marriage. There was a time where it was at worst indifference and at best complete support of the issue. And so to ask taxpayers to, pay for these surgeries that it's still up in the air if these things really are, life-saving like that. I know you'll find people like perhaps Brianna, I don't want to speak for you, but just there's people who claim that it is, right? And that they wouldn't be here today without them. But when you look at, how much effery has been done with the suicide rate statistics and how politically charged those are, right? It's just kind of like, I don't really know what to believe about how life-saving these surgeries are. And so the argument that it should be, paid for by taxpayers, I just don't know. I really don't think so. And especially so long as, it's interesting. We're sitting here, talking about like trans adults transitioning now. And unfortunately, for most of the public, when they even hear the trans issue, they only think of kids because that's how much, the trans kid side of this has monopolized the entire conversation because it's just that abhorrent. It's just that insane to people. So no, I hate to be, but I will do it. I hate to be the tough love person in the trans community, but you're going to have to go back to figuring out how to pay for your own surgeries for a while. You're going to go back to, having to deal with the fact that nobody wants to use your pronouns for a while. You're going to have to, you're going to have to. And frankly, if I'm just going to be real, things were better for trans people when nobody knew what the we were, when nobody really paid attention, when nobody really cared that much. It may have been harder to get medical care, but hey, that's life. I mean, not to make it about me, I paid for all of my, transition. And was it hard? Yeah. Was it worth it? Yeah. But I just think that to ask anything of the public on this topic right now, it's just not the time. Like we got to give it a few years. We got to give a few years of some good faith behavior. We got to get a trans sports league going. You know what I'm saying? Really show people that we can do our big one as far as competing against each other and respect women. We got to reframe the conversation that transition is about adults. We got to stop with the stuff about, dating preferences. And I never want to hear a they, them pronoun again. I just don't.
Yeah.
And when we have 2 years of that, I think people will be surprised how forgiving the public is and how much they're willing to be like, you know what, maybe we can reconsider. But as of right now, you're not going to catch Blaire White talking about the taxpayer needs to pay for anybody's vagina.
So Brianna, for you, I think the surgeries are different because those are quite expensive, but maybe this makes me like the woke lib of the panel, but if being trans is a medical condition and hormone therapy or something like that is the treatment, it actually makes sense to me. It'd be covered by insurance and it'd be covered by government health care the same way that other medical treatments, including something like anti-anxiety medication or something like that would be. Where's your thought process on these questions?
Well, this is where we're going to get into nuanced policy stuff, because again, the problem is the lowered standards. We have people that are out there getting these plastic surgeries that just would not have qualified for it 10 years ago, 20 years ago. They're not trans. Some of them are transvestites. Others of them, they're going to regret this stuff. So I think and I've actually talked to, trans healthcare providers that are plastic surgeons about this that have been shocked as their patient population has just 100% changed in the course of 10 years. They used to do like FFS, cheekbone implants, jaw reductions, rhinoplasty, the same stuff Blaire and I have had done. And now they're doing like all these masculization surgeries. So I think it's a medical problem. But I think part of it is we're getting the wrong people in the door because the standards have been lowered so much. You can literally self-ID your way into a lot of these surgeries. And the other thing, Blaire, I don't know if this still existed when you transitioned, but when I transitioned, we had a rule that you had to actually go out in the world and hold a job for a year before you could get this stuff, just to make sure you were socially integrated, that you could function. Okay.
It didn't.
That would rule a lot of people out these days.
Well, it was a good rule. It was a good rule. You think I would have loved to just stay in my house and screwed around on IRC or whatever, but I had to go get a job. And that really helped to integrate me. The old school gatekeeping used to give trans women a path to get better. It's like, you feel you've got gender dysphoria, go talk to a therapist. Okay, you've talked to a therapist, go talk to a doctor. Make sure you've got no healthcare issues. You did that, you're on HRT, go get a job so you can get vaginoplasty. Go get some other letters to show you've got no comorbidities. This is a path that we used to go on that set us up to be normal socialized women. And there's a reason why I'm a little bit more well adjusted than a lot of the younger people out there. So it's not that I don't think insurance should pay for this. It's I think it is untrue if you're claiming there's not people getting these surgeries paid for, that it's not serving. And it comes back to the central problem that trans healthcare, the politics have come first, and we've got to change it so the healthcare comes first.
Yeah, I agree. Just to, expand slightly and then we can move on, is like, I completely agree. It's like, you can't really in good faith say that, insurance needs to pay for this stuff when the entire methodology for who gets it and who doesn't and what kinds of surgeries has all been so warped.
Yeah.
So until it's depoliticized and we get some doctors in there that really know what they're doing, then this can really be seen as something experimental. And that's where me being, a conservative actually plays into this, because I actually believe in experimental treatments and therapy for people. I believe in alternative therapies for cancer. I've seen them work. I believe in alternatives to mainstream science. And unfortunately, what we have here is that the way the trans issue is being handled, the mainstream science is jacked on it. So until, it's fixed, then I would say no.
So here's my hard question for you. How do we fix this, Blaire? Like, you voted, you worked as hard as you could to get Trump elected. I worked as hard as I could to get Kamala elected. We can still be friends. Like, we disagree on that. But here we are. We're two trans women that feel like our civil rights vehicle has been hijacked by lunatics. How do we, trans women, actual trans women, not pretend trans women, not non-binaries, how do we build something where we can have a say in our own healthcare again? Because it's so clear to me, the reform is not going to come from the ACLU or GLAAD or any of these organizations that went for these maximalist policies that are making the public hate us. How can we regain this? Because as best as I can see, we've got to have like an army of Brianna Wus and Blaire Whites that are out there speaking for our community, telling the truth about what we know and don't know about science, and trying to educate the public and say, we're not all fucking crazy like you're seeing on TV. That is literally the only idea I've got.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of corrections need to be made. There needs to be a period of, reconciliation and frankly, destroying what is. Like, what trans is right now needs to be destroyed. And people can take that as me saying like trans people need to be destroyed. Absolutely not. I'm not trying to get destroyed. I'm trying to destroy this ideology that's been birthed around the trans issue that did not even exist 10 years ago when I transitioned. And people don't even believe that. 100%. But when I transitioned, I started in 2015, coming up on 10 years. The first thing I did was say, you know what, let me go to a support group in my city because it might be helpful for me to, be in contact with other people going through what I'm going through. I found myself at a round table with 10 to 15 people. Almost all of them identified as some kind of they, them, some kind of Zer, some kind of trans mask, trans femme. And I'm looking like, oh, I'm like the thing in the medical literature, like the transsexual. And I knew right there something was wrong.
Yeah.
And so that needs to be ripped apart. Yeah. And if people like that want to still use whatever kind of phrases for them, I think actual trans people, transsexuals like you and I, need to have a real big issue with them. Need to have a real big issue, need to be real loud about it. And actually, back to what I said, kind of that we need to humble ourselves thing, especially, people who we need to humble ourselves, because you need to force yourself to have more of an issue with the trans shit that's become than the conservatives that are mad about it. No matter how hateful they are, no matter how much you're going to be on X or on YouTube and you're going to have to read comments about how you're a mentally ill man, you're going to have to hear it, and you're going to have to still have more of an issue with the gender fluid they, them, who is conflating your medical condition with what they are, because those are the people that conservatives are actually mad about. They don't know it, a lot of them, but those are the ones they're actually mad about. So that's, I think, been the biggest issue. It's hard for people in the community to, if they're going to pick their enemy, which one they see as their enemy, they're going to pick that caricature of the conservative who's like, you're a man, over like the gender fluid who's like, I'm transgender too. My pronouns are bunny self. But for me, the thing that makes me different from those people in the community is like, I've seen those people as way more of a problem, because the only reason the conservatives are mad is because of those people. And the proof in the pudding is the fact that, I've had a 10-year career in conservative media, with 1.5 million YouTube subscribers, most of which are conservative, many of which are deeply religiously conservative, who still find common ground with me and who still see, themselves in me based on all these other traits that paint me as a person, not just trans. Yeah. And when they realize that trans can be something other than those screaming blue-haired activists, you would actually be so surprised by how much they are actually grateful to be freed of some of their hatred. People being hateful or being mad or having anger, it doesn't feel good. Yeah. It does not feel good. And so what I get a lot of is, thank you. I didn't know that I didn't have to be mad about this topic. I didn't know I didn't have to hate all of these people. And so you can actually become, I'm trying not to get too religious here, I'm not going to quote anything, but you can actually become the healing in these people that you see as your enemy, these conservative right-wingers who wear MAGA hats and say you're a man. You can heal them by being the bigger person. And that's what people don't understand. We're a community that's very much hung up on the victim complex of things. And so it's impossible for us to see us as bringing on any of this backlash. But the reality is, the cold hard reality is, a lot of what's coming down the pike right now, when we're talking about, a second Trump term, first of all, it's not as bad as people are saying. Like, we need to get over the hysteria, the detention camps.
No concentration camps for trans people.
Pre-genocide. If God forbid you can't have an X on your driver's license anymore. You should have never had it in the first place, right? So, and we can get into that as well. But the main thing, I know that, I think this is where you and I differ just a little bit, Brianna, and it's not that I don't respect it, because this opinion is valid as well. Your view is very valid here, that like, you're just kind of, from what I can see, you're like, how do we go forward and fight for trans rights in a way that actually makes sense? And for me, I'm like, I think we actually need to stop fighting for trans rights for a while. Because it's not as if the community has proven that they can even do that in an effective way. So I may trust you to do that in a more effective way than most people in the community. I may trust myself to do it. But by and large, I think it needs to be encouraged for trans people to just sit down for a while.
So I don't disagree with you. And just to be clear, my inbox is filled with the exact same thing, but in mirror land from Democrats. I was on, Free Press yesterday, Barry Weiss's podcast. I must have gotten like 40 messages this morning from people, Democrats, saying thank you for talking about this. They're looking for an off-ramp from the craziness. So I'm 100% in alignment with you there.
And it's also important that you're that, because a lot of those liberals, they won't find they won't see the Blaire Whites as the ship out. They'll see you as that. So that's why.
So you're doing your people, I'll work on mine. I think that's great. But at the same time, and first of all, I 100% agree with your assessment. I was the first trans woman to ever transition at Ole Miss. And I know conservatives can be lovely people to trans people. Some of the people that helped me the most when I was transitioning were Bush-loving conservatives, right? And I also really agree with you, Blaire. This attitude did not exist 10 years ago, that biological women needed to shut up and we needed to go conquer them. And if they had some problems, they just needed to sit down. I think about every single woman that helped me when I was transitioning. Like, I am thankful to her to this day. I called up one of my friends from high school, like just this week. I'm crying on the phone with her saying, thank you for teaching me how girls socialize with each other. It's been so helpful for me in ways you don't understand. The moment we started treating them like an inconvenience should have been like an alarm that something was deeply wrong with their community. I think like one of the psychological differences between us is I think I'm much more of I believe that the best we're going to get on this is what we fight for. And I think trans women do deserve a medical organization that actually is interested in the science. I think we deserve a political organization that's actually interested in our civil rights, not the non-binary political project, but you and I, like looking out for this in a common sense way. And it's so frustrating because I'm looking around for the leaders and we don't have any. It's all this nut job progressive fringe that won't even come on the show to talk about this stuff. So
yeah, we tried. We tried to get a true lefty activist to come on.
She's not crazy. She's a good friend, but there are other people.
Well, we invited multiple people, and they all said no, which is always interesting when people. It is not exactly a hostile gotcha situation, but
well, did you tell them I was coming?
Yes, and then
you shouldn't have done that.
I thought they would want to engage with you, right? You're like
no, they don't want to. They don't want to.
They've seen too many people get cooked. All right. Well, thank you both for having this conversation and coming on. And to everybody out there, let us know what you thought of the conversation. Do hit that like button. Make sure you're subscribed. Let me know who you'd like to see, what debates, what topics you'd like me to feature on the channel. And we'll talk again real soon.